the question is, how did Indian soldiers help the UK in World War One and World War Two? So this is a great question because I remember doing a speech on Remembrance Day at my school, and here I am wearing my poppy, standing at the front of school doing an assembly and giving this reading. And I'm looking behind me, and all these pictures are of white soldiers. And I'm just thinking, like, I mean, it's really sad what happened, and all these soldiers fought, for sort of our like nation. But were there any brown soldiers at all? Were they? Like, I just questioned it in my head, but I didn't think anything of it. And then obviously, when I started to do my own self-research, I realized that actually there was a vast majority of brown soldiers. We just don't get taught about it. So the Indian Army, there was around over 1.5 million in the First World War. And, these were Muslim soldiers, these were Sikh, these were Hindu. They came from all different regions like the Punjab, or like the Tamil Nadu. And basically they were part of the Indian expeditionary force, and they were basically fighting on the front line for Britain, alongside them against Germany. So they went to different countries like Egypt, East Africa, parts of East Africa, Gallipoli, and these soldiers were essentially fighting the war alongside Britain. I just didn't know anything about this at all, though, when I was younger. And, it's amazing because at the time, conscription wasn't actually introduced in India, and a lot of these men were basically volunteering as soldiers. So it's like, it is seen as like a heroic effort, and these men are seen as warriors because they went out of their way to fight for Britain. But then I was reading some other authentic stories by people, and actually apparently it wasn't necessarily a voluntary role. It was more like Britain needed soldiers, and they had all of this, like they had all these Indian men, and even the qualifications to become a soldier and to go fight were lowered for the Indian men because they needed these men, and that a lot of them were actually like forced to go because Britain was still recruiting and they actually needed a lot more soldiers, so they used this Indian army. And it's amazing because India literally supplied so much to Britain. They gave them millions in money, food, cash resources and ammunition, and this was mostly because they were promised at the end of the war that they would get their own self-rule. So India would obviously gain independence and be its own country. And what's kind of sad is that at the end of the war, they didn't just get it like that. Like, Britain did not keep their word and didn't give them self-rule, and they did still have to do a lot more after the war to get that. But I think it's really it's kind of frustrating that we don't hear about all of these Indian soldiers, because as a South Asian person, I wonder why I'm in this country. I wonder how I've ended up here. And it's just like, well, at one point my country was ruled by Britain, and then now seeing that all these men fought for sort of my own existence in this UK as well is like sort of like heroic in itself. And I just don't get taught about this, so I didn't know any of this. And that's how the Indian soldiers did fight in World War One for the UK. And I did read up on this, though. Apparently they are commemorated I think they're commemorated by the India Gate monument, and it's just basically to commemorate all the Indian soldiers that did fight for Britain in World War One. But obviously, again, I didn't know that piece of history, or I didn't know about that monument until I went and did my own self-research, because first of all, I wasn't taught in school that there were brown soldiers, and like I was wondering how we still remember these brown soldiers to this day, and it's through the India Gate. And then in the Second World War, I think it was around 2.5 million Indian soldiers who fought for Britain. And they've done it before, like they fought in World War One, and like now they're doing it again in World War Two. And I think that just goes to show the sort of like the strength and sort of bravery of Indian men going out and doing that. I think they were called Lascars, so like they were military men from India that were fighting for Britain. So they were going to different places like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and then most of them were in Asia because they were fighting against the Japanese army. And it's like so many soldiers died. I think that's what we need to remember as well. Like a lot a lot obviously went over there, so like, you know, millions, but then thousands, like over like 87,000 Indian servicemen were killed. Many became prisoners too, so they were held captive, and I think around 35,000 were wounded. And I think, you know, it's amazing what they've done and everything, but we still don't know about it. However, at the time, they were apparently awarded like decorations for their bravery. So they were given either like the Victoria Cross or the George Cross. And I think, you know, putting these two wars together and just seeing the holistic effort from Indian soldiers clearly goes to show that Yasmin Khan was right when she said that Britain didn't fight World War One and World War Two. It was the British Empire, because the British Empire encompasses, you know, India and other countries as well, like that were fighting, like because of those black soldiers too. Like, so it encompasses other countries that were fighting alongside Britain, you know, against the enemy, let's say. So I'm really glad to talk about it, because, you know, I can know then that Remembrance Day isn't only just about white soldiers. It's all about the white, brown, black, different types of soldiers that were fighting for us. And it's just a great memory to sort of to live within my current society and know that there was people out there, my ancestors were fighting for my existence.
I think it's so important what you said about the pictures that you see in schools. That, you know, that if there are any teachers watching this, you know, when you are teaching about World War I, which you all do in Year 8 or Year 9, make sure that there are plenty of photos of Indian soldiers. There are plenty of them. So if you use those images to make sure that you're disrupting the narrative that these were just white soldiers that were fighting for Britain in both World Wars. If anyone wants to go somewhere in Britain that tells you a little bit more about Indian soldiers, I would really, really recommend going to, when you can, when it's safe to do so, etc. I'm going to Brighton Pavilion. So Brighton Pavilion was turned into a hospital for Indian soldiers. And Saida Singh actually was a nurse and visited.
Yes, she was.
And she gave like postcards of herself, which I think is amazing. And so I visited there last year, and there are just, I cried when I was there, because I was so overwhelmed with going somewhere in the UK and seeing sort of all these sort of the belongings and images of these Indian soldiers that fought and were sent there because of their injuries and stuff after World War One. And what's really interesting is there is a memorial there as well called the Chhatrapati Memorial, I think. I wasn't able to go there at the time, but the reason why that memorial is there is because Indian soldiers who died because of their injuries were cremated as per their religion, and their ashes were scattered at where this memorial is. And I go on a trip every year with my Year 10s to Belgium. And a couple of years ago, me and my department, we got really obsessed with this idea of, were Indian soldiers cremated or were they buried? Because obviously, you know, when you think about Hindus, for example, obviously burial is cremation obviously is what they believe needs to happen. And I did quite a lot of research into this, and it turns out that actually the British did a lot to make sure that the religious sort of rituals and stuff of Indian soldiers were really adhered to. So for example, they would make sure that food for Muslim soldiers was kept separate to Hindu soldiers, that, you know, soldiers were cremated in the way, or, you know, were buried in the way that went with their religion, things like that. And that was because they were scared about an uprising. Oh, so wow. Because they were so scared about the fact that, you know, an uprising might happen, and they relied so much, as you said, Roheema, on the Indian army. They were so paranoid about it. And so, you know, Indian soldiers, for example, they were given flour to make chapatis in the trenches. You know, and there was and ghee was sent to the soldiers, and there was mithai was sent as well. You know, and it's all these. There's so many interesting aspects of colonial soldiers in the world wars, and these little things. I remember. The reason why I'm saying that is because I remember this was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I was teaching about Indian soldiers. I remember there was a boy in my Year 9 class. I won't say his name, but there was a boy in my Year 9 class. I remember he put his hand up and he said, "Miss," and we were talking about Indian soldiers, and he said, "Miss, did the soldiers eat halal food in the trenches?" And a few kids giggled and looked around, and I just looked at him and I said, "That is such a good question. I'm not sure, but I'm going to look into it." And then I looked into it, and they were. You know, and you know, it was very, very clear that they were, you know, that they were given separate food to the Hindu soldiers, etc. So, you know, when you do teach this to the students, their minds go to interesting places. They think, oh, you know, so if I was there, would I be able to eat the food? You know, and it's just so interesting to think about it. It's interesting as well, Raheem, what you said about the volunteers and things like that, because I've also read that Britain specifically targeted Indian men who lived in villages because they were not literate necessarily, and they wouldn't question what
the letters back home because they couldn't communicate because they weren't literate.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, there's all these interesting things. I guess the other thing I wanted to say, final thing, was Indian women were also involved in World War I and World War II. I've recently discovered that Indian women who worked for the army had these uniforms that were like army shirts and saris at the same time.
Wow.
And they're just really, they're so cool. And I found these photos of these women in these sort of army sari uniforms, and they're amazing. So I think Indian women also contributed. And again, we don't hear about that necessarily, but it's so fascinating and so important. And sorry, I'll say one more thing, which is the British Legion, who obviously are the ones who run like the poppy appeal and stuff like that. For the last few years, they've been really, really good at highlighting Black and Asian soldiers and the contribution that they made. They're doing a big thing for Victory in Japan Day and focusing on the Commonwealth soldiers, for example, this year, because obviously it's a 75-year anniversary. So there is more being put out there, but we need to, you know, when it comes to November and it comes to Remembrance Day, we need to be wearing our poppies and talking to people in the South Asian community and beyond about why we should be wearing them as much as everybody else in this country, because people who look like us contributed to World War I and World War II, but it's just that no one knows about it. So if you've never worn a poppy before, wear one this year, and wear it with pride. Because we, you know, the people, like I said, we deserve to remember the soldiers, you know, soldiers who died as much as anyone else does.
Yeah, like I agree, because, you know, after that frustration of not really seeing any representation of brown soldiers, I remember thinking, like, I'm not going to wear a poppy anymore. Like, why should I wear a poppy? Like, this country doesn't even remember the people that fought, you know, for them, and it gives them no sort of like recognition of that in schools. But then I was like, Raheema, you're sort of like defeating the purpose, because one, it just sort of makes you look disrespectful to those that did die. But then second of all, like, that would open a discussion, you know, you see a brown person wearing a poppy, and if you're going to say, oh, well, why are you wearing a poppy because you're brown, like you shouldn't really be wearing a poppy because the UK doesn't care about, let's say, ethnic minorities in a generalized sort of view. And then you can say, well, actually, no, during the war, there was, you know, brown soldiers, there was black soldiers. And I think that's a really great way to start a discussion, like, you know, having that on show and making people question those things. And one last thing, I totally agree about the South Asian women that were in the war effort too. Like Sophia, like I said before, Sophia, she was one of the nurses, wasn't she? And she was helping soldiers that were wounded. And she obviously campaigned more for, like, you know, women's effort to be in the war effort, and to show more recognition towards that. There was a lot of South Asian women that were probably, like, you know, contributing towards the war effort. We don't know absolutely every single name, but we can acknowledge and celebrate the ones that did.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, guys. Like, it's been a pleasure, like, having this panel discussion. I think you all did, like, absolutely amazing in answering the questions that you were asked. And you know what? I really loved it. Like, this is such a safe space for me.
I actually learned so much. Like, I'm gonna go. Can I someone send me a list of all the names I need to research?
Literally, I'll do the notes that I made.
Okay, thank you.
I just feel like, you know what we were saying before, in school we were like the only South Asian people, and we were sort of talked over and we were silenced, and like, here we are as grown brown women talking about South Asian history in our way, on our terms, with like nobody like questioning us, and just being able to freely talk about it without feeling uncomfortable.